All right, folks, get ready for this. Today we're diving into something pretty unique. Greek cornbread.
Cornbread, huh?
Yeah, I know, right? Not exactly what you think of when you hear Greek cuisine, is it?
Not really.
But trust me, this is going to be interesting. We found this awesome YouTube video from a Greek home cook, and they make this cornbread that's, well, it's not quite what we're used to.
Right off the bat, the cook says it's more like a savory cake than actual cornbread.
A savory cake. Okay, I'm intrigued. So
Yeah.
what makes it so different? What sets it apart from, our classic American cornbread?
Well, the cook makes a point of saying that this isn't like boba.
Yeah, it's a simpler Greek cornbread. The cook kind of implies that it was a food people ate a lot during times of famine. So this recipe is something a bit fancier, a modern take, I guess you could say.
Fascinating. So there's this historical context right from the start. Love that.
Yeah, it definitely adds another layer to it. And speaking of layers, the ingredients are a really interesting mix of modern and traditional.
Oh, like what? Well, they use frozen corn and baking powder. Things
Yeah.
you wouldn't find in a super traditional recipe.
Right, convenience. Makes sense.
But then they really emphasize using high-quality Greek olive oil for the health benefits and the taste.
Makes sense. Olive oil is such a staple in Greek cooking. It's like they're saying, we might be using some modern shortcuts, but we're keeping the heart of the recipe authentically Greek.
Totally. And that authenticity comes through in some of the techniques, too. Like, they make their own buttermilk.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. They use lemon juice and milk.
Right, exactly. Kind of a neat trick, isn't it?
Yeah, I was wondering about that. How does that change the flavor?
I mean, we can only speculate, but I'm guessing it adds a tanginess that you wouldn't get with regular buttermilk. It definitely piqued my curiosity.
Mine too. What else stood out to you technique-wise?
Well, they toast the flour in olive oil before doing anything else.
Wow, that sounds interesting.
Right. It's not something you usually see with cornbread. And then they whip the eggs until they're light and fluffy, almost like you're making a cake, which I guess goes back to the whole savory cake idea.
Yeah, yeah. All these little details are really painting a different picture than, the cornbread we usually think of.
Mm.
And then there's the cheese. Manouri cheese, is that
You
right?
got it. Manouri is a semi-soft Greek cheese.
Hmm.
Pretty mild flavor, a little tangy.
And they use that in the cornbread.
Yep. It's a breakfast cornbread, apparently. So I guess the Manouri adds a nice touch without being too overpowering early in the morning.
Makes sense. I'm actually kind of surprised they didn't use feta.
Right? But I think the Manouri is a good choice. Keeps things light.
I see, I see. And, speaking of breakfast, the cook makes a comment about the shape of the cornbread being a bit of a trick, like to make people feel fuller with less food.
Yeah, that was interesting. They bake it in a big, round pan, so it ends up pretty thin.
Can, huh?
Yeah. And they connect that back to the bata, that simple cornbread we talked about earlier. Oh, right, right.
It kind of makes you wonder, right? Was it intentional? Like a way to stretch the food further? Or maybe it's just a tradition that's stuck around.
That's such a cool idea. I love that there's this deeper meaning potentially woven into the shape of the bread. It's like we're getting a glimpse into a whole different way of thinking about food and its history.
Exactly. There's so much more to it than just ingredients and instructions.
Totally. And speaking of the cook's instructions, did you catch that part about greasing the pan?
Yeah, with a gorlio.
Right, that's the new season olive oil, right?
Yeah, fresh from the harvest. They even mention how fragrant it is. You can just imagine that aroma filling the kitchen.
Oh man, I can practically smell it now. And the way they describe the final taste test. Soft in the mouth, bursts of corn, and a satisfying chew. I'm telling you, this cornbread is calling my name.
It definitely sounds unique.
Yeah.
And the whole video just makes it seem so much more appealing.
I know, right? Like, it's not just a recipe, it's an experience, it's a story, it's a connection to a culture. You said it. Makes you want to jump right in and make it yourself, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I'm already planning my trip to the grocery store. But before we get too carried away, I'm curious to learn more about this blata and the whole history of cornbread in Greece.
Me too. I think it would be fascinating to delve deeper into that in the next part of our deep dive.
Perfect. Let's do it.
Welcome back, everyone. Ready for more cornbread adventures?
You bet. I'm still thinking about that blata and its connection to times of famine. It's really amazing how food can reflect a culture's history, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's like you can almost taste the resilience in those dishes.
Exactly. So tell me more about blata. What do we know about its history, and was it really a staple during those tough times?
Well, Finding concrete historical records about a specific dish like that can be tricky,
Right.
but it's definitely plausible that bota, being a simple cornbread, probably made with just cornmeal and water.
Yeah. Basic ingredients.
Exactly. It probably played a big role when other foods were scarce. Cornmeal is pretty hardy, and it could sustain people.
It's like a culinary survival story. Makes you appreciate those simple recipes even more.
It does, yeah. It's about ingenuity and resourcefulness, making the most of what you have.
And it makes this modern Greek cornbread we're talking about even more fascinating. It's like we're seeing a modern take on a dish with such a rich history.
Absolutely. And those modern twists are really interesting, too.
Speaking of which, we talked about those frozen corn and baking powder. Do you think those changes impact the final product compared to that more traditional boftar?
I'm sure they do, yeah. I mean, using frozen corn is all about convenience, right?
It makes it easier for people to try the recipe.
Exactly. And the baking powder, well, that definitely makes for a lighter, fluffier texture.
Not the dense, probably crumbly bataille from back in the day.
Probably not, no. But it's a way of adapting the recipe for a modern palate.
So it's like they're finding that balance between honoring tradition and appealing to modern tastes.
Yeah, I think so. And, the core of the recipe is still there.
Oh yeah, for sure. Especially with that emphasis on good quality Greek olive oil. The cook really highlighted that.
Yeah, they weren't messing around with that. I mean, it's
Yeah.
not just about the fat content. Good Greek olive oil has a flavor and aroma that just makes everything better.
Right. Like they're saying, we might be modernizing some aspects, but we're not compromising on authentic Greek flavor.
Exactly. It's that fusion of old and new that I find so interesting about this recipe.
It's kind of like Greek cuisine itself, isn't it?
How so?
Well, it's always been about fresh, simple ingredients, but there's also this willingness to experiment and modernize.
You're right. Yeah, it's about finding new ways to present those traditional flavors.
And this cornbread is a perfect example of that. We've got history, convenience, tradition, modernity, all in one dish.
That's like a little microcosm of Greek culture.
Exactly. I love that. But we haven't talked much about the manouri cheese yet, and I feel like it deserves some attention.
It does, yeah. I mean, it plays a crucial role. It adds that creamy, slightly tangy element that balances out the sweetness of the corn.
And remember how the cook suggested it for breakfast. I can just imagine that warm slice of cornbread topped with manouri cheese and a cup of strong Greek coffee.
Oh man, stop. You're making me hungry.
Right. It just sounds so good. And it fits perfectly with the whole vibe of this recipe. Traditional flavors presented in a modern way with a focus on those key Greek ingredients.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's like this deep dive has taken us on a sensory journey through Greece. We've learned about history, culture, and the art of cooking.
And the best part is we're not even done yet.
That's right. There's still more to explore in part 3.
Welcome back, deep divers. I'm kind of feeling like we need a Greek coffee break after all this cornbread talk.
Yeah, wouldn't that be nice? Sitting on a sunny patio somewhere?
With a slice of that warm cornbread.
Okay.
Okay, focus. We're almost done with our deep dive, but there's one more thing I wanted to touch on.
What's that?
The video itself. It's not just the recipe, it's the whole presentation. It just feels so authentic.
Oh, absolutely. The cook just has this warmth about them. It's like they're inviting you into their kitchen to share a family tradition.
Exactly. It's like you're learning from a grandma who's been making this cornbread for years.
Yeah, there's that sense of experience and history that comes through. And, it brings us back to that whole idea of modern versus traditional that we keep talking about.
Right, right. Even though they're using some modern shortcuts like frozen corn, it still feels so connected to tradition.
Totally. It's like they're showing us that you can adapt a recipe for a modern lifestyle without losing the essence of the dish.
And I think that's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating. It's not just about cornbread. It's about exploring a culture through its food.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We've learned about history, tradition, even a little bit of psychology.
And we've gotten to experience it all through the eyes of this passionate home cook. It's like we've taken a virtual trip to Greece.
And eaten our way through it.
Well, almost. But you know what? I think it's time we encourage our listeners to take that culinary journey for real.
I agree. This cornbread is calling to be made.
So, to our fellow deep divers, go find that video, watch it, experience it, and then get in the kitchen and give this recipe a try.
And as you're savoring each bite, think back to everything we've talked about. The history, the techniques, the passion behind it all.
And remember, food is more than just sustenance. It's a story. It's a connection. It's an adventure.
Well said.
Until next time, happy cooking, everyone.